Okay, right now we're sitting with Michelangelo Signorile, and you are the author of a brand new book. We're at the Los Angeles Times Book Festival, I should point out, but you're the author of a brand new book called It's Not Over. I'm going to read the subhead, Getting Beyond Tolerance, Defeating Homophobia, and Winning True Equality. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. Your book, It's Not Over, seems to indicate, first of all, it would seem to indicate there's been a lot of progress, because if you're having to remind people that it's not over, that means you've gone a long way. And we'll certainly talk a little bit about that. But there does seem to be some things happening. It's March or May or April, I should say, 2015. There do seem to be some things happening in the news right now that seem to be proving the thesis of this book. Maybe you can start with this sort of timeliness of some of those things in terms of your publishing this book.
Yeah, you know, there's been, as you said, so much enormous progress, and it happened in such a short period of time. And by June, we may see the Supreme Court rule in favor of marriage equality across the country. But I think a lot of people weren't paying attention to how the enemies of equality, those who are against gay rights, are working diligently, organizing, and have been organizing for a while. And what happened in Indiana and Arkansas with these religious liberties bills wasn't sort of just a thing that popped up out of nowhere. I write in the book about going to the Conservative Political Action Conference, the Values Voters Summit, and seeing how these anti-gay conservatives, religious conservatives, were organizing this whole religious liberties campaign to try to blunt gay rights.
The interesting thing about Indiana and Governor Mike Pence, and just kind of put context around this interview, is that there were other states that had passed some of these things, but Indiana's was more restrictive in some ways and seemed to be just a bellwether. There's an attack on Indiana. At the same time, there seemed to be also a little bit of a backlash on the amount of anger that kind of came through the social media channels and whatnot. It sort of came at that one pizza place that decided that they weren't going to serve
That's right.
Gays and lesbians pizza at their weddings and that one thing. And it seemed to be there was a little bit of a backlash against the action against that. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe that plays into some of your thoughts about where we're going right now?
Well, I think the fact that the pizza place that said they wouldn't serve gays, somebody started a GoFundMe campaign and they made $1 million, shows the intensity of those who are opposed to gay rights, but also opposed to the idea that gay people should be, like every other group, not discriminated against based on someone's religious beliefs. I think it proves the intensity of it. I also think what we saw play out in the media, unfortunately, sometimes becomes a big spectacle that looks like, oh, this group won, we won the battle, we got the governor to back off, and then we had the reaction with the pizza place. But you have to kind of pull out and see the larger picture. Indiana has no protections for LGBT people. This law really wasn't necessary. It was like overkill for most of the state. The local ordinances that they have, local ordinances are generally toothless in places like Indianapolis. Arkansas, they had already rescinded 3 weeks before with no media attention a bill. They rescinded all local gay rights ordinances in the state. So in the larger picture, it looked like we won this media battle with all these companies coming out in support, but the forces against gay rights really had a win in Arkansas, and under the radar they passed one of these bills in Mississippi late last year and nobody paid attention. They're now reframing it in Louisiana with different wording. So, we sometimes see it play out in the media and it looks like one thing, but they rely on rewording these bills, and they also rely on the fickleness of the media not paying attention.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the themes in the book, the idea of the right and the argument against gay rights or gay, lesbian, transgender rights changing. There's a recalibration of the argument. You talked earlier about the Supreme Court. In June of this year, they're going to make a decision about gay marriage. There's predictions that we're going to move to the other side in terms of gay marriage. So you're seeing a little bit of a retreat on one hand from some of the arguments against gays, lesbians, transgenders, but there's a recalibration of their tactics.
Yes, and you can see them on at their panel discussions and places like the Federalist Society and elsewhere saying, if we pose this as, if we come off as if we're against gay rights, we lose. This is the social movement of our time, and so we have to reframe how we talk about this, because they truly do believe that somehow it is an affront to their religious beliefs, even though it's ridiculous. Nobody is saying you have to do anything in your church, or that you have to in any way change your belief system. Simply saying in the public sphere, in employment, public accommodations, you can't discriminate. But they talk about reframing it in that way and not looking anti-gay, and that's why we saw Governor Pence saying, I'm not in favor of discrimination. And it's very similar to, there's this expression, dog whistling, that has been used to talk about how some politicians still try to reach people with racial animosity. They use code words that kind of the general public doesn't get, but those who harbor those biases do get. They're starting to do that with gay people. They have to dog whistle to those anti-gay forces to get them out to vote and not be so overt. And that's why I think it's more dangerous at this point.
You're talking about an argument now that's much more nuanced, an approach and a response that's much more nuanced than the loud, angry response that maybe dominated the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. Now you're talking about staying focused at a time when the media is reporting that 60% of Americans want gay marriage, and that even Catholics, or millennial Catholics at least, are for gay marriage, and that we've crossed over into the majority of most social groups. In terms of people wanting it. So that's perceived by most people as a positive. Mm-hmm. So now your argument is much more nuanced, that this is no time for relaxation, when I think a lot of people are like, phew, we can not think about this for a while. Are you finding this a tough audience to reach?
Well, I really caution everybody to take all of the polls, as always, with a grain of salt. I did a lot of research in this book, looking at those polls, and then talking to researchers who do a lot of researching on and studies of implicit bias and how that works. And what they told me was, you see these polls that show 70% of Americans support laws banning discrimination against gays, or a majority supports gay marriage. But when they wanted to see change over time. When they looked at the change in implicit bias using implicit association tests, they found the change has been very small. People now, and this is a measure of progress, people now may not want to say they're opposed to gay rights, but it doesn't mean they don't feel uncomfortable about it. And that allows, again, this messaging that's more the dog whistling, the implicit messaging, to get through. So I say to people, just because you see the poll saying one thing, it doesn't mean that in everybody's everyday lives they're not experiencing that bigotry if they're gay or lesbian. It's just much more subtle.
You're, as an activist, you've been around this subject for a long time. You're an iconoclast. You've been very vocal. You're very soft-spoken for someone who I perceive, but you've been around this for a long time. Do you see the danger that maybe is happening maybe on the feminist movement, the people that carried the water for a long time, and now you're seeing sort of young women today saying, I'm no feminist, I don't know, don't label me a feminist, which I'm sure has women who've fought for a long time for the rights of women and call themselves proud feminists concerned that is there sort of a receding effect that's happening now? Are you seeing similar things in your movement and your activism? And how do you fight against that?
Well, I'm seeing the warning signals of that, and I wrote this book specifically to say, look at what happened with the women's movement. Look at what happened with African American civil rights. We just saw the Voting Rights Act completely or almost completely gutted by the Supreme Court. If African American civil rights activists thought it was over in 1964, they obviously were mistaken, and we still see, of course, all of the horrible issues playing out against African Americans in the culture. With regard to women specifically, Roe v. Wade, you had a court case, and then you had the Equal Pay Act passed, and many women thought, okay, it's done. And some were even saying, oh, we don't even need the Equal Rights Amendment. Remember, there was a effort to get an Equal Rights Amendment passed. But here we are all these years later. Pay equity is still a major issue. Rape culture is something that is endemic. And then we have the issue of reproductive rights and abortion and the backlash and the way that rights have been taken away. So I'm warning those in the LGBT rights movement against those in the women's movement who said, oh, it's done, we're post-feminist, that term popped up. We don't need to really be out on the front lines. We need to sort of blend in and fit in. And we see that with some gay activists, like, let's be magnanimous, let's not focus on difference and how we're different, let's try to show we're just like everyone else. That's a trap.
Yeah, I understand. And there's a word that comes up whenever when this thing comes up that maybe you're not your side of the equation is not being a gracious winner. That you've made so many advances, and that to still pound the drum is showing in some way that you're not being
magnanimous.
Yeah, magnanimous.
Yeah.
I mean,
or you're a sore winner.
Yeah.
We saw a lot of this, and we continue to see a lot of this rhetoric. Every time there's one of these flashpoints, even recently with Indiana, the New York Times columnist David Brooks said, the gay rights movement should lower their tone a bit. And I think all of that is a trap, because you allow some space for those who are working against your rights. I think you have to always remain confrontational and always challenge that bigotry, and not think that, not succumb to what I call victory blindness in the first chapter of the book. This sort of intoxicating, spellbinding moment. For gay people, you have to realize that we went through eons, centuries and decades of being invisible, derided, and marginalized. Then finally getting our voice, in the 60s and 70s, only to then have AIDS, just this horrible trauma decimate the community, and then boom, we get these wins. It's intoxicating for people, and it seems like, okay, it's inevitable. But I think we have to push back against the inevitability argument. It's never inevitable. You have to always make it happen.
There's something about some of the way of protests today, especially with social media, that it seems almost like cotton candy. It comes so quickly. There's such an explosive reaction with social media, and then it disappears as quickly as it came. The Indiana thing is a perfect example to me. It's almost as if, and by the time people watch this interview, they may not remember who Mike Pence was. Right. And everything moves so quickly now. The victory is won, move on and move to the next social media explosion, whatever happens to be. It might be something else. What do you think about social media and activism, and do you think it's a positive or a negative?
Well, I think it really can be an enormously positive thing, and harnessing it is important. I see it as one tool, and it troubles me when people only focus on social media. You need to still get your body out in the street. You need to still protest. You need to still go to Washington. You need to still march on Washington. There's no question about it. And not be seduced by the idea of these moments that social media and then the traditional media blow up, as you say, that are forgotten. And I do think that those who organize against gay rights have become very savvy about understanding those moments. If they can try to get things done under the radar when that moment is over, they'll get it done then, and nobody's paying attention, and that's the real danger.
The Los Angeles Times Festival of Books wants to ask, they specifically wanted me to ask you a question relating to your literary idol. So I'm going to ask you, and you give you a second to think about it, and then we'll close. Who is your literary idol, and why?
For me, Larry Kramer has been an enormous influence on my writing. His his breadth of, fiction, nonfiction, novels, plays, screenplays, even now his new book that is over 700 pages and is a history, his telling of history that he says is a real history and they're saying is a novel. It's always pushing boundaries. Whatever people want to say about him and say about his work and what they think of his voice, it is always pushing boundaries. He's always vindicated later. And I always feel like no matter what Larry Kramer does, I can't be ever as extreme. He empowers me because I feel like, okay, Larry's that far ahead. I can say this. He's out there, sort of out front.
Excellent. Well, Michelangelo Signorile, the book is It's Not Over. You have a great radio show on XM Sirius, or Sirius XM Progress, and you're also a contributor to the Huffington Post Gay Voices. You're a communicator extraordinaire. You're all over, and I appreciate your hard work, and it's really nice to meet you here. Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck with everything.
Thank you.